are at the last section, and that is called cultural diversity. And under this, there are many interesting concepts that I'd like to talk about today. And yes, in due time, I hope to upload the lecture notes. It won't be the same like full text lecture notes, but sort of abbreviated, sort of thinner version, okay? So, as you'd all agree, culture is not static, it's fluid, it changes all the time. And so we're gonna look at some of the concepts associated with cultural diversity that come about because of these changes that take place. So first is cultural change. So through discovery, invention, and innovation, I'm not going to talk about each one of these concepts, but diffusion and so on, what often happens is something called cultural lag. I'm sure you're familiar with this. Oftentimes, technological innovation takes place first, and then we would hope that people's worldview or the mindset changes together. But oftentimes, there's the gap between technological change and the way people behave or think. So put it another way, often the changes is made in the material culture, usually technology. But it takes some time for the non-material culture to catch up. So before it catches up, that state of the gap is called cultural lag. So, well, can you think of any examples? So, spitting. Oh, how is that related to cultural lag? Again, cultural lag, I think, typically, if not all the time, involves certain technological advance, but non-material culture not being able to catch up. Yes? So downloading files for free. Cultural lag thing is not as easy as I would think. But here's an example, as you can see there. How about stem cell research? Right? It's state-of-the-art way of curing certain diseases, and yet people have sort of ethical issues with that, right? And also, I think the use of ultrasound to detect or to determine or to find out the sex of the fetus. The abortion issue. I don't know if that's really a good example, but I think other than those sort of serious examples, we could definitely think of more trivial examples. I think with your example of, let's say, a person not readily using emails, for example, to communicate, but to stick to writing hard copied, the actual letter writing. For someone to actually stick to that and sort of have this idea that letters should be more personal. It should really be about somebody writing rather than sending or receiving this very mechanical, this impersonal texts that you see in emails. I think that could be an example of cultural lag. But I think it would be useful to have this good understanding of the definition, how there is this technological advance or changes in material culture, and with whatever change that takes place in material culture, it takes longer time for non-material culture to catch up, and the gap that exists between material culture and non-material culture is a cultural lag. Yeah. Oh, that's a very good example. Facebook. I mean, I don't use it, although I always get these invitations to check out the latest news or whatever. Is it a case of a cultural lag, or just not wanting to be part of this new trend? It's something to think about. Yeah. Counterculture is involves more active sort of participation on the part of those who are part of the counterculture, whereas me not getting involved in Facebook, it's just being passively non-involved. So counterculture would be too strong a term to describe non-involvement in a particular trend. Okay, so that definitely is. Oh, definitely. I think. Well, Twitter. I don't know how many people are like followers of Twitter, or actually person who sends messages through Twitter. See, I haven't done that, so maybe I'm behind time. But that would definitely not categorize me as a counterculture person. Okay. Good example that you brought up. Anyone else with a comment? Well, cultural lag and counterculture they're not terms that are always associated together. It just happened to be brought up together, right? But counterculture, to put it, simply, we're talking about a culture that is opposed to the mainstream culture. So we could, example would be Ku Klux Klan in the USA. It's an extreme form, but a mild form would be the hippie movement, right, of the 1960s. So whether that represents cultural lag or not, I think to a certain extent, it could be a form of counter culture. But to be part of counterculture, it has to be somewhat actively involved in sort of opposition against the mainstream culture. Okay. We'll move on to the next one that I want to talk about, and that is ethnocentrism. I think this term, I think a lot of you are familiar with, right? And I think there's a very good quote. One's own group is the center of everything, and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. I think, to a certain extent, I think every one of us is ethnocentrist. Wouldn't you say? I mean, we do like to believe that we are cultural relativists, that we like to respect other cultures. Maybe we even pay lip service to how we cherish this cultural diversity. But deep inside, I think a lot of us tend to think that something about our own culture is better, right? And I think we often make judgments about other cultures based on our own criteria, our own culture. Okay, so that way we are all we all subscribe to ethnocentrism. Okay, and ethnocentrism sometimes serves a positive function, that because it brings people together, because they believe in this idea that their culture is somehow different, often ways in a better way. So it has led to nationalism and patriotism, and international events like the Olympic Games and FIFA, World Cup soccer, often bring people together, and those events do promote, in a way, ethnocentrism. Okay, and a related concept to that is xenophobia, which is defined as the unreasonable fear of foreigners or strangers, or of that which is foreign or strange. And the next slide is it's a term that you probably are not so familiar with, and that is called xenocentrism. How many of you have heard this term before? Anyway, it's a term that I wanted to share with you, because I think there must be some countries or some cultures that may have this very strange mix of ethnocentrism and xenocentrism. And the definition of xenocentrism is the belief that the products, styles, or ideas of another society are better than those of one's own culture. Now, I think it's much better now, right? I think Koreans are very much more ethnocentric than xenocentric, but I would say as late as the 1980s, even 90s, I think a lot of Koreans tended to be xenocentric. They sort of often thought of products made in Europe, the USA, as being better than their own. For example, Sony television was much preferred over any TV made by Samsung or LG. Even with cars, we still have this, love for BMW and stuff. But I think Koreans take much pride in, having built or have, as producers of one of the best lines of cars in the world. But I think it all came about due to this long and concerted effort by the government and the mass media to instill pride in Korean culture. In the minds of Koreans. So, is this something that is relevant to your own culture in any way? Okay, and if you are nodding, is there any example of your own culture being somehow xenocentric? Oh, I think these example is not a good one, right? Desiring German cars, I don't think it's a good example of xenocentrism. But aren't there people or cultures which have this very negative perceptions of itself and prefer? So that's why I said, if you go back in time to, let's say, the 1970s and 80s, xenocentrism was rampant among Koreans. they thought of, let's say, European culture as better. So they would brag about listening to Western classical music, and there was a little pride of, let's say, people had of Korean traditional music or Korean classical music. But now, how nobody would sort of berate, like, put down Korean classical music, Korean traditional music, be it pansori or farmers' music. There's this, again, consensus among Koreans to believe that is traditional Korean music that we should all respect. But that didn't exist, let's say, up to the 1980s. So for some cultures, this could be an ongoing process. This could be a phenomenon that's happening in many developing countries. So I think this phenomenon has a lot to do with the economic standard of a given country. That's just my guess. Yeah. That's ethnocentrism, the belief that Korean beef is the best, right? As late as the 1990s, you know what number one beef was in the minds of Koreans? Best beef in the world. It was American over Korean. Now the table has turned, and because there will be a flood of American beef import, there has been this ideology, reverse sort of a attack from the Korean beef industry. They have been very successful in inculcating this idea that Korean beef is the most tasty and also even more nutritious. Whether you could, but DNA testing shows that beef is beef. Okay, 1 second. Microphone. We'll do that from now on.
But one of their major arguments was that Korean beef was safer than American beefs, right?
Yeah. Well, I don't want to get into this whole beef controversy. And even in terms of safety, I don't know to what extent cows in Korea are tested. I don't know what the sort of a testing standard is in the USA. But one thing I can tell you this much: Canada holds, I think, the world record for having had, I think, 15 cases of mad cow disease reported. And you may go, oh, 15 cases. Maybe I shouldn't eat Canadian beef. But actually the truth is the opposite. Because in Canada, every cow is tested. So 15 cases being reported means the rest is clean. Okay? Every little piece of beef you get to eat from Canada is clean. It's tested. Okay? It's mad cow disease free. But in the case of American or Korean beef, I don't know. Why? Because one thing for sure, not every cow is tested like in Canada. Okay? So I hope I'm not a representative of the Canadian beef industry or whatever, but just making a point of how you should look beyond, right, what's on the surface in terms of this beef controversy. Okay. All right. So thanks for pointing this out. We'll from now on pass around the microphone so that you could hear what the students say, right? So that'll keep our TA a little bit more busy, right?
Yeah, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Okay, cultural relativism. Well, you're all familiar with this, right? Cultural relativism is the idea that there's no real right or wrong about any aspect of culture, but we have to understand a given culture from its own point of view, right? So there's this quote by Franz Boas: civilization is not something absolute, but it's relative, and our ideas and conceptions are true only so far as our civilization goes, unquote. So, but I think cultural relativism has many critics, because how far do you allow this cultural relativism idea to justify what appears to be an obvious case of human rights violation? I think one of the most shocking examples would be what happens in some parts of Africa against women. You know what I'm talking about, without me actually mentioning it? I think it's called what's the exact term? Yeah. Yes. Thank you. Genital mutilation, in which women's clitoris is cut. Okay. And this is done in a very unhygienic way. It's very painful, and yet the culture in which this is practiced is justified by saying it's our tradition, right? So should that be allowed in the name of cultural relativism? Okay. What about well, that, and can you think of any other examples where sort of cultures come to clash over a particular practice or belief? Yeah. 1 second.
What about the various restrictions to women's rights in certain Islamic countries, for example?
Yeah, so even there, they would say it's their religion, right? Islam, that says how women should not be actively involved in public matters. So I just read the news today that Saudi Arabia will be sending a female athlete to London Olympics for the first time ever. Okay, so until now, women in Saudi Arabia were not allowed to wear these, even the uniform, right? Of let's say wearing shorts and T-shirt sort of goes against their religion, right? And in the case of Taliban in Afghanistan, that women were not allowed to even go to school, right? So cultural sort of extreme cultural relativism would say, yeah, why should we bother with that? That's their culture. We should not intervene, right? So the point would be, where do you draw the line? And I think the most gruesome example would be the female genital mutilation, right? It's just a horrible practice. Using our standard of sort of a culture, and so on. Any other examples? So please now wait for the microphone.
Hello? Okay. What about honor killings?
What?
Honor killings?
Honor killing.
Because we think it's completely inexcusable to kill someone, but the family is like, well, she shamed her family name. She did this and she did that, so we had to do it to, cleanse her spirit and whatnot.
So, students at Nanjing University, do you know what honor killing is?
So what's honor killing?
Honor killing is practiced by families where if a family member, if a female family member has committed an act that would bring shame to the family, so that would be, for example, an adultery, right? Or in an extreme case, premarital sex, or having a relationship with someone that would tarnish the family reputation, would be considered so that women would be executed, would be killed by family members, and that is honor killing. So
Yeah.
in the using again the family relativism, cultural relativism argument, that should be okay, because we these cultural diversities should be sort of left alone, because there is no absolute sort of a standard of saying what is right or wrong, right? So that would be that is an excellent example, honor killing. And you've heard of many stories that we have read in the newspaper in places like India, right, where wives who could not bring enough dowry, right? Would that also count as an honor killing? I think they have a different name. Yes. No. It is said that thousands of women are killed because of this conflict, of them not bringing enough dowry to the man's family. Okay. Anyway, let's move on. Global culture. Is there such a thing? I think one of the things that has one area that has been impacted quite a bit because of globalization is that culture today is very global, because people have with globalization there's speedier flows in many different directions of information. More people go to different places than ever before. I mean, imagine this campus 20 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago. Would you expect this many foreign students in any classroom? No, right? But so because of this healthy intermixing and also exchange, we have now what is called global culture, which is pretty much dominated by American/Western culture, right? And I think there are many arguments as to whether the global culture that we talk about is mostly Western/American, or whether the flows have been bilateral, not bilateral, but sort of coming in both ways. What are your thoughts? If you look around, from your personal experience, what do you see as a global culture?
I don't want to say that it's just global to describe it, because I feel like it is mostly one way, not it's not like a two-way thing. Like it's a north-south sort of, west to east or west to south. I don't know. Because like, for example, English or like fashion and clothes, it's mostly those ideas going outward, but I don't think we've, on the other side, adopted just as much from the east. So I don't think that it's like a melting pot or anything. It seems like it's just a one-directional effect.
Hello.
I kind of agree, and I guess a lot of like literature kind of sometimes labels globalization as like westernization, but I do think there's also like the other way, because there has been this, I guess, wave of like Western culture, but like you've got so many people in like England and America watching like Korean dramas and Korean pop music, and like and you know, food and everything. So I think there's also like a flow in the other direction.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of people would agree that it flows both ways, but against this big wave, maybe this one little drop from the other side. I think, yes, K-pop, Korean dramas, but sushi, kimchi at Korean restaurants. But compared to like McDonald's being everywhere, big, Burger King, Pizza Hut, right? I think so. You could sort of see how it's one little dot against a big, block of black whatever. So yes, it goes both ways, but I think it's still pretty much in one direction. And there's, you can't blame the situation, because I think culture has a lot to do with economic power. And in the last 200 years, the economic power was in the hands of the West, right? And that pretty much determined the taste, the popular culture, and a lot of aspects of culture that we tend to enjoy or engage in without really thinking much about their origin. Okay, but as I always say, as much as I don't want to admit, if you just look around, pretty much everything that we take as our culture is all Western, right? And I would say, like, even in this room, name it something that is Korean. Where did the bottle come from? No. The okay, the content is Korean, but you see the bottle. Did we invent bottles? Plastic? So I'm sort of referring to maybe ridiculous examples, but that's the kind of sort of a cultural influences we're talking about. Okay, all of these because of diffusion, innovation, and transmission. Right. Anyway, I'll stop here, and we'll take a 10-minute break, and then we'll start with Korean culture. Okay. Thank you.